So Ingrid, you can hear us. You can't see us, unfortunately, but there's a lecture theatre full of people.
That's wonderful. We're still wearing masks, and I can't tell you how good it is to see a complete face. So I'll just keep looking at you.
Okay, great. Ingrid, today's symposium focuses on painting, and as we do also have a room full of the recent MacPherson's Mayfair paintings here currently on display in Guam, which I think is a perfect jumping off point for the discussion of contemporary painting, because for MacPherson, painting can encompass so many things. Likewise, in a contemporary context, it provides a lens that's still vitally relevant to students and emerging artists. And as we were saying, Ingrid, earlier this week, I think that painting is kind of stretchy. It allows for all sorts of different kinds of discussions to happen within this kind of one umbrella. You don't necessarily have to be, well, you can keep an eye on the canon and its history, but you can also be quite disrespectful and to also, you know, push it to its limits, which many artists do. So the show here at the Art Museum is called Nominal Gestures and demonstrates how MacPherson's deeply interested in language, the ways it creates system of knowledge, and how objects might be designated as art and as painting. In the first room, as many of you wandered through this morning, you can see the artist's personal collection of these elegant water divining tools. And in the second, we see the group of the Mayfair paintings, and in the final room, an installation, Pelican Dreaming, 18 Frog Poems for Greg C. from 1984 to 2020. But what I'm keen to do today, Ingrid, is to concentrate on the Mayfair paintings. Perhaps you could introduce this series to us and talk about how it might have come about and how it's structured.
Okay, Angela. Well, it comes, of course, from something now long gone in Brisbane, which was the Mayfair Bar, which was a sandwich shop and milk bar. I forget which street because my mental map of Brisbane has decayed. Was it Albert?
Yeah, it's Albert. I've got the image.
Albert.
Behind me,
yes. Okay. And that was where Robert used to buy his lunch when he was working in the early 80s as a cleaning supervisor at the Brisbane City Council. And from his experiences going there, and also from listening to the men he employed, he produced this text work called I Always Buy My Lunch at the Mayfair Bar, which dates from 1983. It's caps, as you can see. It's unpunctuated. And if you read the text, you'll see it's repetitious and sometimes contradictory. It's very much like spoken speech. And this work comes out of Bob's particularly acute ear for language and his habit of collecting. One of the things he did while he was working at the BCC was he would collect workers' absentee notes, and he'd also collect any bits of rubbish on the floor and would present these in boxes, file boxes, as works of art. This is an installation shot from the Painter's Reach. So what does the text tell us? Well, it's in the first person, which we'll assume is MacPherson. He admires the exactness of some of the sandwich makers, their economy of means. He notes that they have differences in techniques and that they seem to arrive at formal decisions by different means. There's a respect, quite evident, for the nameless workers who make his sandwiches. And he's sort of collecting these little snippets. But it's not simply the collecting impulse that's driving him here. Robert was a keen reader of E. Cummings' poetry and a very keen reader of Gertrude Stein. And he also notes that Frank O'Hara, a very important New York poet who also worked at the Museum of Modern Art, did a series of poems called lunch poems. So there's a lot of literary antecedents for him choosing this topic. And what does he do with this text piece, this single foolscap piece of paper? Well, initially he pairs it with all sorts of paper ephemera, we might call them. Anything, in fact, he finds that's connected to food preparation or to eating, and ultimately even beyond. And with these literally hundreds of sheets of paper, each one of which constitutes a work of art, he then compiled them, and I'm going to show you in little plastic folders, and that, of course, was a way of exhibiting them. It's important, of course, to remember the historical moment in which I Always Buy My Lunch at the Mayfair Bar appeared, and that was in '83, a period of time that was characterised by Peter Cripps when he came to do an exhibition at the Institute of Modern Art 2 years later. He called it recession art. Recession art was an umbrella term, you might say, for a very small group of artists, among them Peter Cripps, John Nixon, recently deceased, who was in Brisbane during that period, the Sydney-based Gunter Chrisman, the outside Melbourne-based Peter Tyndall, and Robert MacPherson, who most of whom had developed a reputation for a certain mode of practice, but had at the same time also developed other ways of working more playfully. And in MacPherson's case, he had a very serious reputation as a formalist painter, and indeed his large-scale works had already been acquired by the National Gallery. So here we are, this very serious formalist painter who's doing lots and lots of humorous ephemera, and he's engaged with exchanging this ephemera with Gunter Chrisman in Sydney and with Peter Tyndall. Now, there's something more going on here than simply people swapping ephemera. It's a kind of distinct way of working that's not oriented towards necessarily the production of painted canvases. It's more playful. It also involves a very different exhibition mode. It's not tied to the commercial gallery structure. It's very much, and this is a legacy of John Nixon, linked to temporary and one might say provisional exhibition spaces in sites that we might consider completely marginalised. And these would be one-day exhibitions where you would go in, you put your work up. Very importantly, you would try to document it. And this would become another exhibition that you could put on your resume. Because at the same time that this was happening, this kind of alternative, you might say, although I don't believe the word was really in wide currency when this began, this alternative exhibition mode, you also have the beginnings of the grant issuing system, which required a kind of documentation that artists were in fact making work and showing it. Some of the things that came out of this exchange were truly extraordinary, both in their volume and in their consequences. So if we could go perhaps to the next image. This was a pair of leather work gloves that MacPherson sent to Peter Tyndall in Hepburn Springs, part of a very lengthy exchange. And the next image. This was a theme that developed in their exchange called hand space. We're in a picture of someone's hand with something in it became a miniature exhibition space. And the next image. This is a variant of hand space, and it helped Peter develop his idea that became a major body of work of large-scale paintings called "A person looks at a work of art, someone looks at something." So in this exchange, then there were certain themes that developed. That might be too big an idea for it, but there are certainly recurring issues. And you might want to think of this as like a pre-Pinterest kind of thing. Robert would find ephemeral things, images in reproduction, magazines, and clip it and send it off to Peter, and Peter would do likewise. One of the items that Peter sent was images of frogs, and this, of course, clearly fed into Robert's frog poem conceit, which became a way of titling work, but also became a way of thinking about work for some 30 years or more within his practice. Recently, MacPherson told me that this period, the Recession art period in 1983 in particular, while he did not have an extensive or really any commercial presence, it was in retrospect a very generative time for his practice because so many things seem to come from that year. And if we could go to the next. This is the archive in Goma of the exchange between Robert and Peter, and it's some 30,000 items. And
so this
Peter,
is one side of the exchange, though, isn't it, Ingrid? These are just.
I think at that point, I'm not sure if Bob's had been included at that point, but I do know it's not even all of the archive because there's like another bay to that. So it's enormous. For a period, like if we think of this as part of Recession art, which according to Peter Cripps, was characterized by kind of a very low purchasing of Australian art by major institutions. This is a very interesting result, 30,000 items held within an archive. I think it's important to note that while this production of ephemera turned out to be extraordinarily generative, at the same time, Robert's thinking as a painter had arrived a few years before this at what started to look like an end point. And in saying that, I think we need to remember that for Robert, painting has always involved doing, but it's also involved thinking. This work, the 3 brushes and 3 texts, is actually called 3 paintings. It dates from 1981, and we'll just go to a detail in the next image. Do we have that, Angela? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Where he looked very closely at the paintbrush, and he sees that when the paintbrush is made, the handle is dipped in paint. So you have, almost by default, a painted surface, a painting. Therefore, there's no need to keep applying pigment to canvas because a paintbrush is a painting. Now, for someone who considers themselves a serious painter, if you get to that point, it's kind of hard to keep painting, or it's hard to keep applying paint to canvas. And indeed, for a long time, Robert stopped doing that, but he did not stop thinking about painting. And indeed, shortly after 3 brushes, one day he was cleaning his shoes and he thought, my shoes are paintings. And that little epiphany, if you will, here we are, recorded on paraphernalia from a hotel, I think maybe part of a complimentary shoe shining kit, will then go on to prompt, if we could have the next image, a frog poem that features painted shoes. So we see a couple of features of Robert's work already. There's this, what I consider his recursiveness, his return, his fruitful return to earlier ideas, and a very particular form of humour. And if we look at the physical form that the frog poem work takes, we have something that we've seen before in that conjunction of the Mayfair bar text and the bit of printed material stuck to it. We have this conjunction of word and image, or word and object, and that's going to continue really right up until the present day. So just as we saw in that example of the Mayfair bar text with the printed materials, MacPherson established this practice of pairing or juxtaposition, of aligning things, of text and picture or text and object. And we can say that pairing offers a structure. It's a way of making work, one thing simply going with another. Now, if we look to the Mayfair bar text, to its actual contents, it offers a different kind of structure. When we think of it as a reflection on painting, on the different kind of operations and exercise of skill that's involved in making a painting, and as well the question of taste. So we might say then that the Mayfair bar text offered him a recipe for making paintings. It provides what you called the conceptual armature for the Mayfair series, which is a 40-year span of work based on that one single text work from 1983.
And we see that the next iteration of this Mayfair series is these signage works. I think that you would all, I suppose, you know, this would be the most recognisable works that we would all know by MacPherson, based on road signs that one would come across in the landscape, but also coming back to language as well, not just a language of mark making, but also that kind of vernacular language and very particular languages. Here in the case of Swamp Rats, which is in the Quagoma collection, that language of very particular part of Brisbane, and the fishing and bait and all of the paraphernalia that's associated with this particular kind of practice. So these works are kind of interesting. Also, I think in the case of Swamp Rats in particular, they need to be read as well as apprehended as paintings. There's a reading and there's a looking going on in these works. But I didn't want to spend too much time on these works because they are so well known, and, you know, I wanted to kind of move on to perhaps the next. He makes so many of these incredible road signage works, but then moves on to the Mayfair Bar Revisited, which is our next slide, Ingrid.
Okay.
The Revisited works.
Right. I want to read a little poem that accompanied the first exhibition of these, I think in 2013, some 30 years after the initial, like, ephemeral text work. Minding my own business, minding my own busyness, mining my own business. Again, that recursiveness, that going back. Around 2010, he was going through his archives and came across the Mayfair bar text again. And he realized that no one had ever used it as a way to make paintings. And he had thought that maybe someone would. So he took up his own challenge and launched into this series of work, which is very different to the signage works that you just showed. And he added the paintings to the text. So the paintings were always shown with the text framed beside them. And when you align the text work with these paintings, the system, if you will, becomes quite clear. So in this one, we have white bread, brown bread, incised with graphite lines to indicate the cutting into sandwiches. Now, over the course of his exhibition history, MacPherson has occasionally issued statements intended as primers for approaching his work. And Angela's point about the reading and the apprehension involved in looking at those sign works actually extends here too, I think, because we need to take what he's written about the work on board as well. And in this statement, he recalled, which was written in 1994, he invoked the formal principles of Colorfield theory, a theory that had been developed some decades prior, but had been very influential on his work as an early painter. And so I'm going to read it. My polemical barrow. It again comes back to formal principles, colour modifying colour, colour modifying colour modifying scale, colour modifying form stroke structure, colour modifying form stroke structure modifying scale, surface modifying colour, surface modifying colour modifying scale, image colour density modifying scale. Some of the same old tricks of informed colour field theory, less the studied pain of maintaining two-dimensionality, of holding the plane, of never subverting flatness. Few indeed. So, lest we think that these works are simply kind of exercises of filling out the Mayfair bar text recipe, they are also, if not first and foremost, paintings according to long established, if now somewhat anachronistic, formal rules. So if we look at this one, this shows all the possible permutations of two triangles or half a slice of bread within a square. This is a very procedural work, and it takes the diagonal cut, which makes two triangles, and spins it off from there in a very logical procession. Other works in the Mayfair bar revisited use the text in a very different way, like this one, where in one corner we might have shades of bread, and then in the other corner, we might have a range of warm colours, which could be mustard, butter, jam, who knows? So we might think of him kind of, in this installation shot, kind of freeing himself up a little bit. And in this work, which is a detail, we can see how, for an old formalist, it provided the opportunity to just take a certain delight in the painterly effect known as scumble. Okay. In MacPherson's words, the Mayfair bar text was something I could use for my purpose. I could always see another way it can go. And I think in the double fats, we'll see they go somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, I mean, Here's the image of one of the double fats, which is, the surface is very different. It's like a kind of slathered icing on a cake, like it's taken in a very different direction. You say that in The Painter's Reach, a painting to MacPherson's mind is not a resemblance, but an object existing in three-dimensional space. Paintings or any kinds of pictures were not to be confused with what they represent. Can you talk about that a little bit more, Ingrid, in terms of the object nature of this, the Double Fat series?
I think it's important to remember that Robert was never particularly interested in making images. He wanted to make paintings that held their own on the wall, that stood up as paintings. And to do that, you didn't need to have an image. And one of the first books, a very influential book that he read in the old State Library, was Sir Charles Locke Eastlake's Materials for a History of Oil Painting, which was first published in 1847. And one of the things that Eastlake kind of traces is the history of the wooden panel. So for Robert, as a very young painter whose principal concern at that time was trying to understand how you could speed up the drying out process of oil paint, how could this object kind of like leave the studio, take its place in the world, to understand that paintings were not images so much as objects that were on the wall. I think you can see that something like this is almost a return to that. Not that he's aping the look of wooden panels, but he's making painted things. I sort of think of it, another twist on seeing painting everywhere is he's pushing painting out into the world. And what's new is this much more pronounced sense of the painting as an object and not as an image. But also what's very new here, or more concentrated, is his titles. For a long time, Robert has dedicated his work to individuals, but now that becomes almost a little story. There's a great, and I think, Angela, in a minute, you're going to read some of those titles.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to go back to this work, which is, I mean, it looks like caramel, it looks like meringue. There's such tremendous pleasure in materials that I think it's another sign of a liberation, that he can just do this. He can work with a spatula, an icing spatula, if he so chooses. And he always details the specific paints used on the back of each canvas. And in a nod to Ivan Puny and other suprematists, some of the works incorporate things of the world right on their surface, like chuck swipes or lids or sealing rings from preserving jars. So included in the exhibition at Guam, there's double fat lemon curd, which has an overpainted chucks on it. Do you have that image, Angela?
I don't think I've got that image.
Okay.
It's
and
just,
there's,
yeah.
Yes, you do. So again, there's the evident pleasure in what he can do with the paint. He can scrape it, he can spatula it. In some works, it's troweled on as if it's holding together two bricks. He can swirl it with a variety of tools, sometimes even his hand, and of course with the brush. And so here in Double Fat Sky Sandwich. Do we have that? The blue one?
No.
No, that's a troweled one.
Yeah.
Okay. So the use of colour is a little different here than it was in the Mayfair Bar Revisited. It's still cued to food, but much less directly so. It's almost as if what we're having is a memory of food, which may be all food can ever be when we think about it. It's a mental image. Or even colour as a smell, the caramel that he remembers, the lemon curd like my mother used to make. And he's often spoken of these works in terms of his mother icing a Christmas cake. And indeed, some of these works, but not all of them, look like paintings you could eat. So he loads up the works. He loads up the canvas, he loads up the brush. And this term, loading up the brush, goes way back to his working life as a ship's painter. And he loads up the back of the canvas with these extended titles. It's as if he's, you know, breaking one of the rules established by Clement Greenberg, who had been so important to him as a young artist, which was that, you know, paintings should not be, or modernist paintings should not be literary or narrative in any way. But Robert, completely liberated from that, now loads it up with stories and memories and names and places listed on the back along with the ingredients or the materials of every work. So let's see what he does with those titles.
So Ingrid, I've actually included here one of the titles from the show, but
yep.
Quickly as we conclude, talk a little bit about these title dedications. The dedications have appeared in MacPherson's titles for, you know, right throughout the practice, and these are often, as I understand it, they're friends or relatives, people he admires, but also these are in this most recent group of works. There's been quite extended kind of more narrative-based titles, which I feel like, you know, kind of perhaps allude to memory. One of them is Mayfair Double Fat, Xmas Day Low Tide at the mouth of Downfall Creek, Whiting fishing with Maury J, Dusk, bull sharks trapped in the channels between us and the shore. Shits were trumps. And that's the image that I've got behind me. But there's also yep. Winter, First Dawn, Sky Window, Bulwer Island, 1967 in memory of Cracker M. So many of the titles that we see in our space actually have locations attached to them as well, which, as I understand it, are many associated with that mouth of the Brisbane River, the area around the airport, Northgate, Bulwer Island, that kind of estuarine space, just very local to here. Can you talk a little bit about that connection to place?
Well, I think you're right, Angela. I think it's a kind of memoir. And memoir often involves recollection of absolute specifics, a particular place, a particular taste, a particular smell. And as I said, a colour kind of cueing a flavour or a smell. It's smell, I think. And if you think of estuarine places, they have their own distinct smell. That's the sense that's most closely linked neurologically to memory. And it's as if now he's gesturing into somewhere that painting can't really go unless you're going to make smelly paintings, and people have. But he's going to allude to that. Yes, And the other thing I think that's interesting is it's so, there's so much detail, whereas before his titles have been quite mysterious, but now it's all there, it's amplified.
Mm.
But
also,
he's go on.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that there's also still those dedications to other artists as well. Strzeminski is mentioned twice in titles within our show.
Yes.
So that's a kind of reaching right back into art history as well.
It is, and he saw Strzeminski's work on one of his trips to Europe, so it's a reaching back into his own past. But I think it's very funny to pair Strzeminski with an avocado sandwich. I mean, I just find that a very funny conjunction. But that's maybe me, or maybe it's Bob. But you can do that. But even I'd like to point out too that even the title fats, I mean, we call these double fats. Fat is a reference to a certain kind of glaze. And he used to talk about glazes with a particularly close friend. So that is simply that title is a recollection of her memory. And it also recalls, as he tells me, 3 brothers he knew, one of whom was thin and he was called Fat, one of whom was fat and was called Thin, and the third brother was called Bomber. And there you are. Again, it's that weird verbal sense of humour.
It's a very particularly Australian kind of...
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things kind of become mixed together.
Absolutely.
You wanted to finish our discussion with this amazing image of Giacometti.
Okay.
And I think that that's kind of... it's interesting to bring into play now as we started in terms of talking about MacPherson's relationships to other artists and that kind of sense of communities of artists. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about this work in particular.
All right. When the double fats were first shown in Sydney in 2018, MacPherson included this in the package of work that he sent, which we might want to think of as another primer for his work. And he called this picture Giacometti's Trousers. And it is, of course, a picture clipped and stuck onto some backing, so much like the ephemeral works from 1983. Giacometti in his studio, photographed by a German photographer whose name was Ernst Scheidegger, around 1960. And what Robert particularly noticed, of course, was that wonderful encrustation of plaster on the sculptor's pants. Now, Giacometti might seem a very unlikely source for MacPherson, but he articulated something that Bob has understood for a long time. He talked about his Montparnasse studio, which was very Spartan. And he said this, he said, when I took this studio, I thought it was tiny, but the longer I stayed, the bigger it became. I could fit anything I wanted into it. I think Robert MacPherson understands the way apparently small things can generate tremendous possibilities.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful kind of perhaps concluding comment. But I also think in terms of the context of, you know, being here today in a room full of, you know, mostly practitioners also, I also was thinking about this quote that you made in your essay in the Goma catalogue from Ian Byrne, who wrote an essay called Is Art History Any Use to Artists in 1985, which is a really amazing kind of discussion really of some of these ways that artists will create their own lineages and antecedents and not often wait for art historians to keep up or create that history for them. He writes, neither authenticity of the anecdote or the empirical veracity is an issue. A story without any factual basis may serve to reveal greater cultural truths than any other account. I think that, you know, that is very interesting to think about in terms of the way that MacPherson creates his own senses of logic, comes back, folds back within his practice all the time, and also bringing in references that are completely unexpected and constantly surprising to us. I mean, perhaps been one of the sustaining energies for you, Ingrid, as someone who's returned to his practice many, many times throughout your own career, do you think?
Yes, well, I've been extremely fortunate in having like a permanent telephone conversation with him over 30 years and being so fortunate in his sort of generosity in answering my questions. Even when I've gotten things wrong, he's been very forgiving. But I also want to kind of just follow on a little bit from that comment of Ian Burns that you quoted. And this is something that Peter Cripps said recently in a talk about recession art. And he said, so much of an artist's practice and their thinking in communication with their peers remains hidden from view. And he said that when he met Robert, he came to understand that the talk about strategy and approaches to practice has been a very important part of artistic practice since at least the French salons of the 1850s. But this kind of artist talk, I don't know how much of it we actually get in art history. I mean, we might get Van Gogh's letters to his brother, but I don't know that we have all his conversations with other artists like Gauguin, for example. But that kind of dialogue, one artist with another, one artist with what they perceive to be the history of art that's important to them, we don't always get. But it's very important.
Yeah,
but there might be a question there for the students, which is to what extent they consider art history is useful for them.
Well, maybe this is a good time to turn to some questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask of Ingrid or myself?
Yeah, I'm just interested if, in his paintings and his work, if there's speaking about like a symposium of mixing with food and senses and colour and texture. Do you see that in his work?
Sorry, the question was about the senses being
mixed.
Yes.
Mixing
a synesthesia, perhaps, Ingrid? Do you think that there's something like that going on in terms of the works, of the mixing of the senses?
It certainly struck me when I was writing about them as a possibility, but I don't know that that's part of his thinking. I mean, it's certainly the works allow you to come at them that way.
Yeah, I just when I see his work, I think of that. I think of mixing of senses, particularly with this reference to food and looking at the texture and colour, and you know, that's sort of what I.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, I hope you perhaps you'll have some questions later, and, you know, feel free to approach me. We can also, you know, arrange for emails to Ingrid or further discussion. But I think it'd be great if you could all join me in thanking Ingrid for joining us and